All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for attending our final Tech Tuesday of the year. My name's Tom Levine. I am Cornerstone's technical specialist, as well as a commission specialist here. So I do quite a lot of data entry in my day-to-day, and that's actually what we're going to cover today, is how to enter data and be a little healthy about it. So before we really get moving, I do have a few announcements to make. First, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the question box. I know some of you have already started, so I'm sure you kind of get how that works. But if you don't see the question box there, go ahead and put it in the chat box as well. Either one works. If you have a question that you'd rather save, though, for the end, then that's fine as well. If I don't answer your question right away, I'll probably answer it at the very end of the presentation. Additionally, you can send me information as well. If you send me an email, it's tlevine@sierrandstone.com, or give me a call at 513-487-5390. I'm always happy to help as well with tech advice. Also, if you haven't yet, I'd recommend checking out AGB. It's our kind of updated broker portal. We've had it for a while, but AGB itself just got a new facelift, and it's actually got expanded a little bit. So if you're curious about that, I'd recommend reaching out to your broker advisor and having them give you some information about it. It's also online at www.sierrandstone.com/AGB. Additionally, you can email AGB support@sierrandstone.com, and we'll be able to help you out as well. And finally, there's also Autopilot. Autopilot is part of our agency services program, and it's designed to help make a business plan for you, as well as helping out your clients, your family, and all of that, no matter the situation. Among the services provided are our client referral program. If a client wants a product you don't sell, you can refer them to us, and as long as you're signed up for the program, you should also get a cut of those compensation as well, or a cut of that compensation. Also, there's Parachute succession planning, which is just planning for when you retire, and retirement assistance, that's flight plan, as well as our service agreement, Copilot. So if you're curious about any of that, the URL is at the bottom of the screen there. It's www.crnstone.com/what-we-offer/agency-services-program. So without further ado, let's get started. Data entry is really all about how good you are with a keyboard and typing things in. And I'm sure that's what most of us are pretty familiar with. That said, there's quite a few shortcuts that actually can help you out. And I'm only going to cover it on this slide a little bit briefly. That's because I have an Excel document to open up to show you some of this stuff as well. But we'll run through it real quick. There's Tab, which just moves your cursor to the next selected data entry. There is Shift Tab, which moves your cursor to a previous cell. You can select an entire page with Control A. Control B bolds all of your text selected. C is copy, V is paste, and Z is undo. That's Control C, Control V, and Control Z. Those are all pretty standard, but that's just something to keep in mind. We also have shortcuts for inserting a current date or timestamp. That one I actually find pretty useful myself because it helps me figure out, okay, where am I in logging this sheet? Maybe I just lost sight of what I was doing real quick or got pulled away. Gives me an idea of where I last was on my data entry list. Additionally, there is undo, last undo action, or redo as some call it. That's not available in all different programs, but enough use it that I left it on this list. It's Control-Shift-Z, and that actually doesn't work in Excel or other Microsoft services if you were curious and wanted to try it. Also, there's Alt-Tab, which lets you switch between open windows, and Escape, which cancels the current cell entry. And we do actually kind of have a relevant question here, which is, can we get screenshots? Actually, there's something more powerful that you can do. If you look under handouts on the webinar itself, like however you're watching this, you should see an attached document. That attached document is actually the exact same Excel file that I'm going to open once we're done with all of these slides. So you could follow along in that if you wish. Additionally, we will also have this uploaded to our webinar library, which I will show you at the end of the presentation as well. So yes, you can get screenshots. Also, if you would like to take a screenshot, I think if you do Alt Print Screen, that should get a direct screenshot of all of this as well, Kathy. Also on that Excel document that I was mentioning, it literally has all of these spelled out. So one way or another, I'm sure there's a way you will get them. I'm actually going to go ahead and set this aside as well. I can email you after this presentation is over. Let me just make a note. All right, I have it noted, and I will make sure to get that to you. One of the other things I wanted to mention before we get into more of the actual data entry and how to do that is that data entry causes a lot of stress on your joints and on your fingers and wrists specifically. We all have people that we know who have a lot of carpal tunnel, and myself is kind of included, at least in my fingers. Because of that, I'm always on the lookout for something to actually help with, easing some of the stress of that and maybe lessening some of the pain that you could experience down the road. So that's why I'm kind of highlighting some of these products. The next few slides will focus on that. But first thing I wanted to mention, Bluetooth keyboards. They're extremely, extremely helpful, especially if you're an agent out in the field trying to do a lot of quick data entry. They're pretty good. Unlike most keyboards, they don't have like a USB that you plug in. It's actually all via Bluetooth. So you could take your iPad, hit the Bluetooth option, discover the keyboard once it's turned on, and then you can use it like any other keyboard. You can use it to type forms, enter information, do pretty much anything you would on a normal computer just using Excel. So it's extremely useful, especially if you're going out in the field a lot and would like to at least have the option to use a keyboard. They normally range between 30 and 80 bucks. At least that's what I would spend for it. I wouldn't spend much more than that. And honestly, they're wonderful. I use them all the time. Additionally, there are two other options. That's kind of just two different options of the same type. They're both ergonomic keyboards, the PariX Paraboard and the Kinesis Freestyle 2. Those are just the two most common types of split keyboard that I've seen. If you're kind of like me, you type a lot all day, and I don't know if there's really a good way to show it. But it looks like, yeah, there we go. There's kind of a tilt in my wrist. I'm not sure if you can tell, but that like wrist tilt is just caused because of the way keyboards are kind of made. They're long, you know, kind of columns of keys, and that means that when you're lined up on home row with your hands, it tends to cause your wrist to move in, which can actually get kind of painful if you've got a lot of carpal tunnel in your wrist, or maybe you're just not that mobile with your wrist. It can cause a lot of pain. So it's one of the things that people have made to kind of counteract some of that are ergonomic keyboards. Now, the Pixel or PariX Pixel board and the Kinesis Freestyle are two of kind of the most frequently used options, which is either take the keyboard, split it in two, and then let people kind of angle it however they want to type. Or there's the Paraboard option, which is just angle the entire keyboard's PCB, which is the actual base of a keyboard, and put all the keys on there slightly differently. Both of these are trying to accomplish the same thing. It's just making it a little easier for you to put your fingers on the keys without, moving your wrist or shifting your wrist. And both of these options are honestly great. The Kinesis Freestyle 2 and Pixel Paraboard, along with Bluetooth keyboards, are all available on Amazon for around the price point that I have listed. And I'd highly recommend checking out some different ones if you've got a lot of problems with your wrists as well. One of the other things I actually kind of advise people to do if they're getting into data entry is to buy a separate number pad. and get a separate mouse as well, one that you really like. Now, these two up on the screen are just sort of generic placeholders, but the number pad alone is 15 to 30 bucks. It's an Amazon Basics one, actually. I took that screenshot right from there. And it's actually pretty simple. It just has backspace, tab escape, a little quick calculator button, and then some number digits. And the reason that I recommend these over like full-size keyboards with number pads and everything else included, even though I myself use one of those, is because it's extremely easy to help you switch gears. If you're trying to enter a bunch of numbers, it's very easy to just have your hand on your mouse pad and type those away. On the number pad, maybe, or you just have that separately. It kind of helps break it up. If you're running long strings of text, that's kind of what I use my keyboard for. If you're entering long strings of numbers, it's always good to just have your data entry hand on that key to make sure you don't press anything wrong. Another reason that people get these kind of side keyboards is actually to avoid confusion. If you look at your number pad on your keyboard right now, if you have one, you'll probably notice on the bottom left-hand side, it starts at 1, then 2, then 3, going to right. Then in the row above it, it's 4, 5, 6. In the row above that, 7, 8, 9. But if you look at your phone, your number pad on your phone, chances are it'll actually be arranged differently. It'll have 1 in the upper left-hand corner, then kind of going to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 9 in the bottom right. And that's how our phones are here at Cornerstone as well. That can cause some confusion in your muscle memory for data entry as well. And it's led to a lot of times me hitting like 9 instead of 3, or, 5, well, all the time, but 6 instead of a 4, and things like that. So it's just something you want to keep in mind as well as a good option. I personally recommend, if you're going to get a number pad, get one that matches a phone's keypad, because that way you'll always, be building the same muscle memory, always make sure you're entering things right. Additionally, you might want to change your mouse. I don't actually have one of these trackball mice myself, but I've used them quite a lot. And if I were just doing data entry in my job all day, this is what I'd use, quite frankly. Because I do a lot of other things like programming and I have very wide screens, for my personal taste, I don't use this. But honestly, it's probably my backup. And if I didn't do a lot of other things besides data entry, I'd have a trackball keypad, or a mouse. You use the trackball on your thumb to kind of move the cursor around the screen, and it can let you get really, really accurate with where you're clicking, more accurate than using your entire arm. Additionally, if you've also got carpal tunnel in your wrist, then this is actually a great option because it helps you avoid moving your wrist and avoid moving your hand around too much, because all you're doing is using your thumb to move your cursor. So that's extremely helpful. A lot of these trackball mice also have additional button options, which is actually really useful. You can go ahead and actually assign those buttons to different things. The two on the left-hand side of the clicker on this mouse actually are assignable macro buttons. What that means is you can kind of bind them to do whatever you want. You could say, okay, one click of this highlights text, and you can assign it to do that. So it's extremely useful. Also, a lot of these are Bluetooth as well, but have a dongle, or they'll just be Bluetooth devices. So if you have one of those Bluetooth keyboards from the last slide, then maybe this kind of a thing might be up your alley as well. The final piece of, physical hardware that we'll talk about today, at least to help with data entry, are wrist braces, mouse pads, and BioFreeze. And BioFreeze has a special place in my heart, so I'm going to cover it first. It's actually really incredible, and it's kind of like if you've ever used Icy Hot, like that. You just shake up the bottle and then use the roller to roll it on to pretty much whatever you need. If you've got one of those Icy Hot rollers, that works too. What I like to do is, after a long day of data entry, I'll roll it in between my fingers, in between every joint, and that just helps my whole hand start to decompress and start being less tense. And whoever you are, just having a little less hand stress is always good. Additionally, there are different mouse pads you can get along with different wrist pads. I actually don't really recommend this if you're doing a lot of just data entry, but if it's something you do from time to time and it's just helpful to rest your hands on something soft, then go ahead. The reason I don't recommend it if you're only doing data entry or doing data entry pretty exclusively is because it can kind of hurt over time. If you have your entire arm up at an angle, then it can kind of cause blood to kind of pool a little lower in your arms. It gets a little uncomfortable, at least for me. To each their own. I've heard some people love to have that kind of a pad under their wrist when they're working, but I don't like it. Also, the reason I avoid mouse pads like the one that are up there is because it kind of forces you to have your hand over something while you're messing with the mouse. And well, that's not really that important if you're using a trackball, like what we had on the last slide. It does mess with you if you're trying to accurately move your mouse from side to side. So that's something to consider as well. But they're pretty cheap. A mouse pad and wrist rest like this combo shouldn't cost you more than $60. And if you're spending more than $60 on it, it's either really, really niche and really kind of low production, so you're going to be spending money, or it's something that you got personally customized, which is completely different as well. But most aftermarket rests like this, 15 to $60 is all you should pay. And then that leads me to my final piece of physical help that you can get, and that is wrist braces. Wrist braces are extremely helpful if you have carpal tunnel, especially in your wrist, because it kind of prevents you from over flexing your wrist and kind of hitting where that kind of soreness comes in. It's extremely helpful. And also you can get some of these with like it's almost like a Gore-Tex kind of a palm on it. That way you just kind of slide across your desk and it doesn't add any scuff marks. It doesn't, make a mark. It's just really useful. These also have the added benefit of forcing your thumb further apart from the rest of your hand, which doesn't sound like much, I know, but it's actually kind of nice because it forces your thumbs to be separated. It forces them kind of into a natural position to put the kind of edge of your thumb on that space bar, which is also extremely helpful in my opinion. Actually, one last note on this. I broke my ankle a while ago and I still wear a brace for it, and it's extremely helpful. It's the same sort of thing with wrists. If you've got any sort of wrist injury, I highly recommend picking up one of those if you're going to be doing a lot of data entry as well. And that leaves me to my final kind of parts, I guess, before we open up the Excel document, and that is PDF converters. PDF converters are something that a lot of people don't really use or don't really know how affordable they are, because they're actually not that bad at all. I really like PDF converters because what they'll do is they'll take your data and export it into Excel or whatever other kind of spreadsheeting software you use, and you can completely manipulate it at that point. It's all digital. We use one here called Able2Extract. That's part of why it's at my top tier. It's actually kind of a mid-row priced option, but it works pretty dang well. What I like about it is when it does its conversions, it also tells you where it's saving those files and lets you name them, customize them, change their formatting, do pretty much whatever you want, honestly, as you extract it. And I'm actually going to put links for all of these once I close out of this presentation real quick right before I get into the data entry as well. So you will have links to all of these. My next recommended option is a Nitro PDF converter. That's just because it's a little more expensive for a little less of a product, in my opinion. Able2Extract works really intuitively. You just highlight all the text you want converted, hit convert, and it converts it. Nitro PDF does exactly the same thing. It's a little more expensive. I also don't really like them as much as Able2Extract, because I don't have as much confidence over their data privacy. And it's not that they're, recording everything they convert or anything. That's not the intent that I want to give. It's just I haven't fully read through their licensing agreements yet, so I don't know what exactly they're doing with the converted data. Also, it's 180 compared to 150 for a full license. It's, kind of a toss-up. And then finally, there's Smart PDF Converter, which is useful if you need to convert non-sensitive information, but I would never trust Smart PDF Converter to convert things like, social security numbers or things of that nature from PDF into an Excel format. That's just something that I don't really trust it with. Smart PDF Converter was actually initially set up as an add-on on Google Chrome, if I remember correctly. And I remember having it as an add-on for converting some non-critical documents that I had on my PC. Worked really well. I got all the data converted, but there were a few other errors that wouldn't have been there if I had been using something like able to extract, and it just kind of, the format wasn't quite right for what I liked. So that's why I personally didn't use it, but it's good software. And if you're not converting anything, super critical, like a, social security number, not a bad option. You save quite a bit of money with it too. It's only $40 and 70 for the standard license. So it's our lowest cost tier option as well. But if you, like me, get a lot of statements in PDF format and need to put them into a digital format, then it can save you a lot of typing. Just hit the document you want to convert, hit convert, and it throws it into an Excel format. So that's why I like them. Also, if you have any questions, we will be getting to that next year. But I wanted to put these links into chat real quick before we continued on to our next part. Those are the links to the PDF converter, converter options that I was talking about. They're pretty useful, and I really recommend able to extract. It's very nice. And I also wanted to include this as well. This is a link to our agency services program. And I will also at the very end of our presentation show you where you can find the recordings of this webinar as well. So let's go ahead and get the practice Excel workbook open. I have it right up here. If you are following along, this would be the time to download the handout that I have attached as well. But here we have on the first page all of our shortcuts, just like what I showed on the slide up there. These are all text keyboard shortcuts, and I'll just go through them real quick. First off is the tab key, and if you're doing a lot of data entry, you probably already know about this one. But this works in pretty much any data entry software, including what we use here, our proprietary software. But as you hit tab, it'll go to the right. Your cursor will, and that's the box that your cursor is selected. Anyone who's done data entry before will know you just have a bunch of boxes that you have to enter data into. Tab is probably the fastest way. What they don't tell you is that Shift Tab goes the opposite way. So once you have a cell selected, Shift Tab is how you go back real quick to get back to the previous cell. A lot of people who are data entry experts, who I know and work with a lot, will actually not know that, and they'll tab over to the next box and go, oh shoot, and then reach for their arrow keys to arrow back to the last one, or they'll have to grab their mouse and drag over to click the next box. You really just need Tab and Shift Tab. So that's something that you might not have known. Also, there's Alt Tab, which I'll show real quick, but I don't think will likely work, or at least you won't be able to see it. I'd recommend trying it on your screen as well. Alt Tab brings up a Windows menu of all the active windows that you've got. I'm sure you didn't see that, but it kind of opens up a full view of all the different active programs you have. And as you Alt Tab through it, it'll select different options. For instance, if I Alt Tab and let go now, I'm back at my data entry workbook. If I Alt Tab and let go again, I'm back on my webinar kind of folder that I saved locally to this computer, which was open in the background. So that's actually pretty useful if you're just flipping through a bunch of different windows, trying to get a bunch of different text from one window to another. I think it's a nice keyboard shortcut. Also, Control A. There's something I wanted to show you specifically about Control A in Excel. So if I do Control A, well, on a table that's already kind of made, it'll actually select the entire range of that table, which is really useful if you're trying to move data from one screen to another. But it's not really useful if you're trying to select the whole page. And that's what it'll typically do. Control A in most programs selects the entire page of data. And if I hit Control A again, as you can see, it did that just there. We did have one other question, and I'm actually going to kind of stop for a moment and go through it because it's kind of important. You said to download this. How? It depends on how you're watching this, but if you have the GoToWebinar kind of launcher up, you should see kind of a drop down with like view, maybe a chat box and some question boxes. Kathy, this should be the exact same box that you were typing into for questions. There should be an option called handouts. And if you click on the handouts option, then it should kind of expand and show you an Excel table. It'll be called Data Entry Workbook dash base. That's the base file for this workbook. And if you click on it, it should start downloading. If it doesn't, then I'm really sorry. I can send you this workbook as well separately. I have it noted to email you that shortcut menu, so I'll be sending you this as well, if that helps. Just real quick, is anyone else having trouble finding or downloading the workbook? Just wanted to make sure that everyone who wanted to could download it. All right, I see a few other got it's up in the questions. So I'm gonna assume that if you don't have it at this point, you will be able to get it. Just, send me an email and I'll send you the workbook. Anyway, where were we? I think we just did Control A. Control B is also one of my favorites. It's pretty good font-wise. Control B, just bold selected data. I'm sure that was probably not very visible. So let's do Control A and highlight the full text field, and then do Control B as well. And that'll bold up the text box, or at least the selection range. I like this because I like kind of bolding text as I go through it with data entry. That way I know I've already addressed that column and I can move on to the next. I'm actually not the best with data entry, at least raw data entry, going back and forth, this name, then this name, then this name, then this name. So any little shortcut that I found or that I've got to do these things, I love to share because it makes everyone more efficient. Doing data entry is a big part of my job, but the less you have to physically type, the better. So these little keyboard shortcuts, I love them. There's also Control S, which is save, sometimes strike through depending on the program you're using. So be careful about using that one. That's why I didn't include it on this sheet, but that's just something to keep in mind. If you're going through a list and just trying to strike through data, Control S or Control, I forget what the other one is offhand, but strike through is another great option, and it just strikes through the text. You can do that or find that in the menus as well by doing font options. If you have something selected and click the little drop down tent there, bottom right hand corner of font section on your home ribbon, strike through is right here under text effects. And you can actually even custom assign it to a button if you've got one of those macroable mice or keyboards. So something to keep in mind. Anyway, we just did bold. These three are actually probably your most important ones. And there's one other one that I left out because it can cause problems, but we're going to cover it as well. That's Control C, Control V, Control Z, Control Shift Z, and Control X. Now, X isn't listed there. That's one that can cause problems. But if you're following along, why don't we do two text boxes? We'll highlight cells A7 to B7 and hit Control C. As you can see, those cells have kind of changed to a rotating array of kind of like indents, I guess I'd call them, little divots. Those are pretty useful, and that just tells you what active selection you have in Excel. That's not something that's useful for everything, but it's something that I like. That's just copy, and it copies all of the data that's in the cells you selected. If I then hit Control V, that pastes whatever was on that. So that's just copying whatever you had, putting it somewhere else. There's also Control Z, which undoes prior action. And then there's Control Shift Z. And if you're following along in Excel, that one didn't work. That's the one that is actually not something Microsoft uses, but something a lot of other database entry software uses. Control Shift Z is reverse last undo action. And what that'll do is, like we did Control Z to undo that paste earlier. That's how I deleted that information. I didn't just hit delete. Control Shift Z would have undone that in a lot of other software. So it's something to keep in mind. But the one that can cause problems, and the one that I personally like to use if I'm just copying data that I don't want left where I had it, is Control X. Let's go ahead and do Control X on that Control C line, along with the effect line after it, the Control C and line, that one. And let's highlight column C, row 7, and then do Control V. That's a cut. And what cut does is it removes the data from the cells you had selected. And then when you paste it, it puts the data there and removes it from the prior box. So it can cause problems. That's why I didn't leave it on this cheat sheet. But then I'm just Control-Zing to get back out of it. But it can be useful if you're trying to like copy data to a done sheet or something, and like you've got 2 spreadsheets up, one data entered, one data needs entered, and then you just cut it from one, move it to another. It's a quick way to keep track. So that's why I mention it. Now, these last 2 are kind of my favorites from this entire sheet, and it's because it adds timestamps and date stamps. This stuff can take a long time to type out in Excel, and well, not a long time necessarily, but it can get garbled pretty easy. You know, there are a bunch of different date formats, a bunch of different time formats. I don't really like to mess with them. And one of the cardinal rules of data entry is to always enter things the exact same way every time. So to avoid all that, I use these shortcuts. If you hit Control and then the semicolon key, if you're at home row, it should be where your right hand's pinky is lining up, that semicolon option. If I do Control semicolon in this cell, that'd be C11 if you're following along, that enters a date, and that date is extremely useful. I use it all the time. If I'm entering a long data sheet, I can just put the date I entered in right there, right at the end. It's extremely nice. The other one, if you're just trying to get through a sheet all in one day, is Control Shift semicolon, and that adds a timestamp from the current time. As you can see, it's 10:02, and my timestamp there says 10:02. I think it's an extremely useful shortcut. And the other one I wanted to mention is Escape. Let's go ahead and type a bunch of information into one of your cells. I'm using C7 because it's just what's there. And I just typed out all that info. It's a bunch of random letters, as you can see. Now, let's say I wanted to type in something in this cell, something specific, something like, I don't know, Aziz rocks. But then I realized, oh, I didn't actually want to type that. What I could do is I could hit Escape, and it actually undoes the information that I put in there. Not saying you don't rock Aziz. I'm just saying, you know, that's how you would reverse an entry if you're typing over something you didn't mean to. It lets you deselect the cell and just removes all the edits you were doing. So if you're like me and you're kind of half awake in the mornings, typing something out and realize you shouldn't have been typing there, Escape will help you get out of that box without changing the data that was listed. So let's look a little bit further below. And I actually included these, though I'm not going to cover them in depth today. These are different formulas that you might find useful if you do a lot of data entry. And they're extremely useful, but they're Excel specific. So I didn't want to cover them in depth. All of these have sort of function formats. This is what they will look like in the function bar of Excel. These are all the different variables used, listed in the same order that they're going to be used. And this kind of tells you a little bit about what the function does. This right here, if I scroll over a little further, is actually what that function that I'm listing here in this example will output. And it's using these cells as reference for what these will output. So if you know about formulas and you kind of know how to use them, these are the ones that I think would be really helpful. If not, then that's fine. But it's something that I think is really useful. Which leads me into one last reason, which is why I'm using Excel to kind of cover all of these things. PDF conversion. The reason that I like PDF conversion is because it takes data like a list and it will convert it into a digital format and throw it into a list. Typically, it's a CSV, which is comma separated value, or it's just a base Excel file that it'll convert it into. But what it does is it makes our data that we would have to manually enter from a PDF extremely easy to work with. This is kind of what it'll probably look like when you convert something. There will be a lot of different spaces, things will be misaligned, some things might even have been split up in a box. These are all just random names I completely randomly generated. Any information that seems similar to life, I'm very sorry, but I did not take it into account on this. It was just a good little sample text field that I readied and registered. But the reason I did it is because a lot of people, once they buy their PDF converter, they convert their data and it looks messy and people go, oh, I wasted all this money on this conversion tool. I would have, you know, saved my time and my money and just typed it all into my database. And that's not true. Not true at all, at least. because you can manipulate data so much more powerfully in something like Excel or some other sort of spreadsheet or table. Let's go ahead and highlight the entire page. You can click the upper left-hand corner of Excel, or you can do Control A and select all of the cells at once. Make sure you're on your Home tab in Excel. And then let's go to Find and Select, go to Special. Find and Select is the far right option under Editing. And then what I did there, and I'm going to do it one more time, is I go Home, Find and Select, go to Special. Then I'm going to select blanks and hit OK. Now what that's done is it's highlighted all the range of used cell data that had blanks in it. Now if I right click on that and hit delete, it'll give me an option. What that's telling me to do is when it removes all those blank cells, it'll move my data whatever way I tell it to. I can tell it to go up. I can tell it to shift cells to the left. I can tell it to delete entire rows or delete entire columns as well. These two I would avoid, but I always click shift cells left and hit OK. And what that does is it gets your data from a converted kind of range of information and moves it into all of your rows on your left-hand side. This is a little hack that I use all the time on my converted tables. And what it does is it lets me just quickly skim through data and see what might need corrected. Now, in this one, I see the first name, the middle initial, and last name. Those things are split up. So the first thing that I would do is I would just type in my headers one more time, make sure they're perfect. So we'll do first name, middle initial, and then last name. And then I can delete that first row from the conversion. Now I have all this name information in here. And I know that if there's a space, it's probably messed up a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert a column, highlight my range of data, and then I'm going to do something called splitting columns. Splitting columns is really useful if you've got a set of data, you have some spaces or some other way to break it apart, and you're trying to get things so that you can just have a first name, a middle initial, last name, or just separate any sort of level of data. What you'll do is you'll go to Data, and then you'll select this text to column button. Even in the condensed Excel view, it's the biggest one in this Data Tools section. So that's just Data on the ribbon, and then Data Tools, Text to Columns. Now, what I'm going to do is now that I have all of those names selected, I'm going to choose delimited, and it kind of tells you what it does through this wizard. There's characters such as commas or tabs that separate each field. Then there's fields that are aligned into columns with spaces between each field, and that's fixed with. That doesn't really tell you much. Really fixed with, you set exactly where things are splitting, and I'll show you that real quick. So you see all these names here, and you see this kind of header information up here. It's data preview. Let's go ahead and just click here. So we'll put something in right here, 2 clicks in. That's telling you that after 2 characters, it's going to split the data, which isn't really what we want in this case. If I wanted another split, I could just click this top row again, a little further down the line. That'll split my data exactly where those lines are, no matter what. Not what we're looking for here. Delimited is the more powerful and better option to choose almost every time. What it does is it uses actual characters to separate data. For instance, here we're going to choose space. There's tab, semicolon, and comma as default options along with space, but also let's say you had a little, dash in between all of your numbers. You could hit other and put a dash in there, and it would split the dashes. Let's say you're using commas to separate everything. Well, let's just have it separate by a comma, that kind of stuff. It's really useful for text manipulation. Then I'm going to hit next. And what this does is it tells you what format your text is going to go into. You can skip it if you want it formatted general, which I do in this case. Or if you don't want that formatted generally, then you can actually just click on the data header that you want. In this case, let's do the second column. And let's say I want to convert it to text. That tells me that the data that's in here is going to be in a text format. I'm going to leave it as general this time just because it doesn't really matter. Text will work as well. Then I'm going to hit finish. Now what that did is it took all of the data that should have had a split in the space in this column. For instance, right here, it split up Dean Fillmore into Dean and Fillmore. So pretty useful, especially if you're trying to separate out names based on a character, or if you're trying to get everything into a similar format. Finally, to make sure all of these columns kind of align, I'll do one last check through. I'll realize, oh, this should probably be right here. And then just looking through here, I see this other line right here, ST and ANG. Copy that, click on the Excel, and just put it in. And that way I didn't have to type any of it either. So pretty useful. Then I also am noticing this other name. I'm just skimming through my data. Angus Martin Fillmore. Copy, paste that in there. And then after selecting that cell, I'm going to do a text column again. And that's just to show you what'll happen if you leave that data in there while you split it out. I'm going to say delimited, split it on the space, finish, and it'll tell me there's already data there. That way you know you're not overwriting anything. Sometimes it'll tell you there's data there if there's just blank cells or spaces. That's something to keep in mind as well. Let's go ahead and replace that this time though. And that would be how I just quickly set that up. I know it looked longer than it probably was because I was talking through it, but I think it's pretty useful. Then we have something like this, which is a working file. Let's say that we were trying to enter information about this all the way through into our system. In our database, we separate things out by first, middle, initial, and last name, but a lot of other databases use different formats. So I have some default formats listed up here from some of those text functions I mentioned earlier. If I had a function listed in a cell and I wanted to extend it down the entire row, highlight it all, drag it down, and I have all of that formula filled. It's something useful that you can do in Excel, but not really useful for other things or other data entry software. So I just thought I'd mention it here. The other thing we can do is we're typing it out. I have a policyholder column. I have date entered, a date time entered. I can use those timestamp functions to really quickly enter when I did something there. And if I save and close this file, then I'll know where I was. Another thing you can do is you can actually automatically number all of your lines. A lot of people, at least in my office, know that you can just say 1, 2, 3 on data, highlight the range, and double click the bottom corner, and you can get everything to automatically number as long as there's data there. But there is another way to do this as well, and it's extremely useful if you don't know if there's always data that's going to be there or something else, and that's called filling a range. Filling a range is actually really useful because it's able to automatically number things in different ways that you might have to actually think through to do. Let's say you're trying to number everything by 2s, for example. What I would want to do then is I would go to, and this is actually something I don't do that often, so I'm double checking my instructions as I do this. I can go to a cell, go to the data column, which is automatically what I have selected anyway, most of the time. And then I'm going to go to data tools and go to fill. I believe that is, oh, I apologize. This was actually my fault here. I was clicking on the wrong thing. Fill is going to be in your home tab. And what you'll do is you'll select where you want your numbering to start, go to home, go to find and select, and then or not find and select, I'm sorry, it's the same area. It's editing, fill, and then you're going to choose series. So that's home, editing, fill, series. And then you have a bunch of different options. By default, it'll fill a series of rows, which is the horizontal, you actually want columns here because we're going top to bottom. Then there are different types. Growth is what you'll choose if you don't want things to be linear, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is something that's kind of useful, I think. Then there's step value and a stop value here listed below as well. You can also fill dates, which is why it has the date option there. And you can tell it to autofill a formula as well, if you so choose. I think that growth and linear are probably the most useful though. Let's say we wanted to do every other number going from 1 to 50 on this line. We'll say the step value is 2, the stop value is 50, and we'll use growth and hit OK. But nothing happened. Well, that's because you have to tell it where to start. So one way or another, you have to put in your first number. I put in 1 in this sample. Then I'm going to do the same thing. Home, fill, series, columns, growth. We want every other value, so our step value is 2, and our stop value will be 50. If I hit OK, it fills every other number going up to 50, except that's not really what it did it? And there's one other reason. Can anyone tell me why? I'm already seeing it. So good catch there. But the reason that it did that is because we chose growth. Growth is really useful if you want to count something up exponentially. What we actually did there was tell it to increase our growth by 2 every time. So the first number is 1, the second number is 2. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 2 is 16. And 16 times 2 is 32. So that's why I didn't put that series that way. If I actually wanted to number an entire range using this method, I would hit 1. I know I have 41 cells, so I wanted to go from 1 to 39 probably, because my top 2 cells are taken up by header and disclaimer information. So 41, I wanted to go to 39, and I wanted to fill every row. What I can do is I can go to fill, linear, columns. At series of 1 step, I want to go to 39, and hit OK. And now it's numbered all of these in steps of 1. So pretty useful thing. One last thing I wanted to mention before we sign out for today is data validation. And this is really why I use Excel for data entry. It's incredibly useful. What data validation does is it only lets you enter certain values into a field. I have something over here called box fill, and this is just my generic sheet. It's like a sheet 2. You can forget about it. The only reason it's here is for these lists. And I'm going to type yes and no into this as well, and you'll see why here in a second. In order to enforce data entry validation, you have to select the cell you want to enforce it on. In this case, we'll do F3, and we want it to say yes or no in this column. The way I'm going to do that is by going to Data, and under Data Tools, I'm going to select this little checker X icon down here. It's the bottom middle. I'm going to hit Data Validation. And I'm going to tell it to use, I could do any value, I could do a whole number, but we're going to tell it to use a list. And what this does is it actually creates a list of approved values that can go into this cell. Now you can type out a list manually. That's certainly an option. But the easiest way is to just list out all of the different options that are valid and to give it a source. I'm going to click on this little up underline arrow here and select the yes and no options. Hit that little input box again. Now I can also give it an input message. This is the message that hovers over the box when it's selected. For instance, we're going to put no as a title. And for the input message, let's say, is this person the policy holder? And the error alert tells you what it'll pop up if someone inputs incorrect data. So we're going to call this yes or no. And the error message is this is an incorrect value. And as you can see, I'm typing it in kind of badly, but it's this is an incorrect value. Please only input yes or no as an option. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And as you can see, we've got a message, or at least I think you should be able to see it. Because the box up there is selected, it says yes or no. Is the person the policyholder? If I click on the drop down now, I only get two options, a yes or a no. I'm going to hit yes, and it'll overwrite the data that was in there, and now it says yes. If I select the other options, nothing happens, and that's because we only had one cell selected when we applied this. But let's just say I wanted to apply this to the entire range. All I have to do is highlight the entire range I want to apply it to, data validation, and then set it up the exact same way that I had. Or I highlight the cell, drag and drop it, fill the data, that also fills the formatting. And then I'm just going to hit delete on there. When I delete it, the values get removed, but the messages and formatting things stay the same. So it's something you can use if you only want very specific entries on a sheet. Then you can use that to force you to only type those things in there. It's something that I use a lot because I tend to have some typos if I'm just flying through a file. So let's go ahead and try to enter something else in here. Let's just do employee. And I hit enter. Then it gives me an error because I typed employee, not yes or no. It says that custom error text that we actually put in there as well. And then if you hit retry, it'll let you re-enter it. I'm going to try yes, hit enter, and I let it keep because it's the exact same word, yes or no. That's pretty much all we had listed to cover today, and that should cover a lot of how data entry can work. The reason we were doing all of this in Excel specifically is because a lot of databases have something called importing, and they'll, send out a list of data, and as long as you have those same headers that it listed out, it'll let you import that data as well. So a lot of data entry specialists just type out all of their work in Excel or some other relevant spreadsheeting software, make sure all of their headers are named the right thing, and then just throw it into the system and it updates the records. If you use a system that is based on SQL, then I can almost guarantee that whatever you're using to enter into that database can probably do this. It's also something that Microsoft Access has allowed. So if you have a database you're maintaining in Access, you can also use Excel to manually run through the data pretty quick. So it's just something to keep in mind, and spreadsheeting like this has helped me with data entry immensely. Before I go ahead and stop the recording, thank you so much for attending Tech Tuesday. We do have a website that you can go to watch all of these past webinars as well. And I'm going to jump there real quick before I jump into questions. It's on our main webpage, which is www.crnstone.com. And it'll probably take me a second to load because our internet's a little slow and I'm streaming as well as I do this. But this is our main web page. If you go to Resource Center, Webinar Series, then you can find recordings of all of our webinar series up there, a schedule for upcoming webinars to the right. If you scroll down and select like Tech Tuesday, then you'll see all of our recently recorded webinars here as well if you wanted to review. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week and a great rest of your year. And I'll see you in first quarter. Have a great, great day.